is Warhammer 40,000 Satire? No. Alright, I guess I'll elaborate on that point. Even if a simple no really is all the response such a mouth-breathingly idiotic assertion as 40k is satire deserves. Seriously, kids, just say no. Anywho, let's grab this kitty by the tail and get started, shall we? First, by determining what satire actually is. The most common and useful definition probably goes something along the lines of the use of humor, irony, sarcasm, or ridicule to criticize something or someone. To that not particularly useful list, I would also like to add exaggeration, though it kind of already slots itself in under humor, I do suppose. But the key takeaway here is to criticize. The point and purpose of satire is to criticize something. And to do that, it can use any of the literary devices / tools mentioned previously. Thus, they are, at the end of the day, somewhat irrelevant to the discussion of what satire is. As satire does not need to be ironic, it does not need to be sarcastic, and it does not need to be humorous, but it can also be all of these things and more. This is one of the first and most common stumbling blocks when it comes to defining satire, a fixation on the how, not the why. As the reason why we often think of satire in terms of these devices, say, for example, humor, is because it is an effective vehicle for the purpose of satire, to criticize or ridicule something. Take, for example, one of my favorite TV shows ever, Blackadder. In its fourth and tragically final season, we're in World War I, and we see a British officer proudly display the amount of land captured in the last offensive. When he is asked to what scale this model is replicating the gains, he is informed that it's 1-to-1. That is the land captured in the last offensive, 17 square feet. To which the officer simply replies, "So you see, young Blackadder didn't die horribly in vain after all." It's hardly fifth-dimensional chess satire, but it is effective satire, as the point to critique the absurd waste of life that became commonplace on the Western Front, and the seeming callous disregard of it by the gentlemen officers is communicated simply and inescapably. You laugh, and then you think. We can thus define this as satire, because it achieves the stated purpose of satire, to criticize. And it does it in a less than serious manner, which leads me to another oft-used term when we talk about what is and is not satire: bad satire. In my none-too-humble opinion, there is no such thing, truly. I'm 100% channeling Yoda on this one. There is only do or don't. There is no try. If you fail to criticize the thing, then you have quite simply, well, failed to criticize the thing. And so it is not satire because it does not achieve its intended purpose. And you know what's coming next as an example of bad satire, don't you? Starship Troopers. The finest example of this entire idea. As the director of the movie, Paul Verhoeven, quite famously stated repeatedly and emphatically that the movie was a satire of fascism. Yet, equally famously, the director stated that he didn't actually read the Starship Troopers book by Robert I. Heinlein. You know, the book the movie was based on. And he evidently didn't put any more effort into researching fascism either, as the Federation doesn't even have the power to conscript its own citizens. A strange move for a fascist state. Nor does it have the power to prevent people from leaving and settling planets. All it can do is advise against it, even when the Mormons were risking war by doing so. The Federation's only powers appear to be to enforce the law, wage a defensive war with voluntary personnel only, and provide disaster relief. And to top it all off, the Federation's politicians and military leaders appear to be significantly more accountable than ours. Fascism. Even the most ardent arguer for Starship Troopers being a satire of fascism have to thus admit that it is bad satire. But is there even such a thing? I mean, Verhoeven didn't merely miss on some point of obscure party programming here. His fascist satire doesn't fall apart because the games and theories lads are wearing the wrong shade of grey stormcoats. His version of fascism isn't slightly off base, mildly critiquable by experts on the subject. Instead, it is quite literally the precise opposite of fascism. So in the end, not only did he not criticize it, he didn't even represent it. And if you don't even have the thing you are trying to satirize in your satire, that is not bad satire. It is simply not satire at all. And I am, by the way, firmly on the side of the death of the author here. See, there are occasions where the author's intent is valuable. If you are, for example, looking at a question with no clear in-universe answer, and then the author comes by and goes, "Oh yeah, no, this is that thing," then okay, fine. But authorial intent matters for nothing in a scenario where the intent is clearly opposed by the actual product. It is the same for satire. To illustrate, there is a man. He wants you to break down a wall for him, and he has a sledgehammer for you to use. Alright, fair enough. And the man shows you his sledgehammer. In his outstretched hands is perched a small porcelain pony. The man insists it is a sledgehammer, but not surprisingly, upon smashing the porcelain pony against the wall, it shatters and the wall remains intact. Even so, the man vociferously argues that it was indeed a sledgehammer, and that you just didn't get it. You didn't use it correctly. At this point, most reasonable individuals would agree that the instrument is unfit for its purpose. It does not look like a sledgehammer, it does not feel or smell like a sledgehammer, and it does not do what a sledgehammer does. Thus, we can safely conclude that a porcelain pony is not a sledgehammer, and that the man is quite self-evidently a few sticks short of a faggot. And yet this is exactly the scenario we see with Starship Troopers. We are told that it is a satire of fascism, insistently so, and yet it only ever meets one of the standards. If even that, as, hey, the uniforms are grey, which means that Starship Troopers has as much in common with fascism as a British schoolgirl does. And so we are left again with our porcelain pony, but at least we've painted it in the rough colors of a sledgehammer. Will this somehow make it more effective? No, not really. And so, no matter how many times you slam the porcelain pony against the wall, and no matter how many ways you paint it, it still does not look like a sledgehammer, does not feel like a sledgehammer, and certainly does not fulfill the role of a sledgehammer. It remains a porcelain pony. And so why then do so many people continue to claim it to be a sledgehammer? I believe there to be two primary reasons. The first is very simply that, again, most people get stuck on the linguistic tools of satire or on the man's insistence. Simple ignorance, in essence. An innocent enough mistake. And then there are those who argue satire because it better fits their worldview, and are either incapable of conceiving of a thing that does not fit their worldview, or who are simply dishonest in order to push that view. And that is where we finally come to 40k. Having now adequately figured out what satire is and set the stage, we can ask ourselves, is Warhammer 40,000 satire? And if it is not, why do people claim it is satire? So first things first, what is 40k supposed to be satirizing? As determining what it is intending to critique is the single most important part of establishing if it is indeed satire. Usually, the allegations is that 40k satirizes extreme religiosity, xenophobia, racism, or authoritarianism, with fascism being a particularly common extension on that latter point. Ubiquitous, one might even say, being forced into quite literally any left-wing interpretation of 40k with the same furious fervor one might see in a morbidly obese person trying to reach the last piece of fried chicken in a bucket, yet being prevented by the simple fact that the they-them's arm is just a little too fat to fit all the way in. That, by the way, is a satirical dig at the average left-wing Reddit moderator. Anywho, religion, xenophobia, and authoritarianism/fascism are the most common points then, and often all of the above. Luckily, for the length of this video, they all more or less fall apart at the same point. Namely, that far from criticizing these things, Warhammer 40k provides a convincing argument in favor of them. Let us start with extreme religiosity. In our world, where we do not know for certain whether there is a god, or if there is one, whether or not he gives a flaming fart about us, it is easy to mock the extreme actions of certain parts of the population, or the oddly particular ways they go about things, like the need to specifically fling gays off tall buildings, or mountaintops, for example. The key critique here, then, is that it is irrational. It is silly to not eat pork because your magic book told you so. But whilst this may well make sense in our world, it falls very flat indeed in 40k, because those gods are most assuredly demonstrably so real, and they very much so do care about what you do. And if you displease the grumpier ones, they will forcibly transition your ass into a floundering, flailing mass of screeching tentacles and ever-erupting buttholes. For that reason alone, it might be good to keep the capital G's on side. And if you're an Imperial citizen, then the continued existence of the Emperor upon his golden throne is the sole singular reason you're not a space alien's conflation toy. And that's if you're lucky, as an Imperium severed from the light of the Emperor's guiding beacon is not an Imperium at all, but millions of scattered and isolated little planets surrounded by an endless ocean of hostile alien races. Religion in 40k is a matter of survival. Not to mention a way to keep sane in a brutal and uncaring universe. Hell, even ideas like rationalism and atheism are presented in a completely different light in 30k, where its in-universe version, the Imperial truth, is not about explaining and thus rejecting the old superstitions of religious thinking, but rather a weapon pointed at the very throat of the gods, as its intent is to attack the Chaos powers by reducing them to silly superstitions, rather than the galaxy-ravaging powers that they are. So yeah, the whole mocking it for its lack of rationality doesn't get you very far in 40k. What then about xenophobia? Or to give it its modern name, racism. Well, this is certainly one point in which I trust the left's judgment. After all, there is no man or beast on this good green earth of ours more racist than Lefty. Allow me to demonstrate this statement, as I see it could perhaps be perceived as mildly controversial for those who have never spent any time on a left-wing Reddit. And, by the way, YouTube, this is to clarify a quote from a Marxist, expressly, Reddit. As much as I've been enjoying the Skaven equals ANCAP meme, it struck me yesterday how they can be construed as an even worse anti-Semitic stereotype. The character of Jewish features as rat-like was used by Nazi Germany and dates back even further. They are portrayed weak, grotesque creatures, whom nonetheless run a sprawling underground empire directly under the nose of the Aryan protagonist of the setting. They are subhumans, ghettoized beneath the cities of the upstanding human empires, plotting the destruction of the world as we know it through alliances with the marginalized elements of society. Chaos. They are greedy, short-sighted, and murderous, thinking nothing of killing their own. Am I crazy, or are Skaven completely over-the-top anti-Semitic stereotypes? End quote. Yeah, and let's not even get into the whole orcs are black-coded thing, shall we? My point is that if there is anyone out there that could be said to be experts on hating people who aren't them, then our modern-day progressive movement certainly ranks at the absolute zenith of that list. And so if our experts on the topic assure us that there is xenophobia in the 41st millennium, then who am I to doubt it? And hey, there is plenty of anti-xeno sentiments, but then our problematic question raises its head yet again. Is it satire? Alright. What in the case of prejudice against races / I suppose species in this case, would we be satirizing? Again, the answer is probably absurdity, ridicule, irrationality. As it does indeed seem pretty crazy to judge someone's personality or mental faculties based entirely on appearance or skin color alone. Again, fair enough. But by that metric, the Imperium is not racist at all. It is the very definition of egalitarian, in fact. Men, women, blacks, whites, Asians, young and old, they're all meat for the machine. Whether they serve in the Imperial Guard, or craft cogwheels, or grow corn, it is all a vital part of the unified task of keeping humanity alive for one more day. And what was the reason again why the Imperium is struggling so desperately with all available resources just to live for another 48 hours? Oh, that's right. The hordes of Kup's fucking demon, and insidious aliens that hold all-night circle jerks lubricated by human tears. Even the most peaceable of the major alien races are, at best, utterly ambivalent towards the survival of humanity, more than happy to sacrifice millions at a whim if it will spare even one Eldar life, or simply looking to subjugate humanity in their own empire, like the Tau. To make a long point short, xenophobia requires a phobia, an irrational fear of a thing. It is entirely, however, and utterly rational to fear the Xenos in 40k, as 9 times out of 10, they are there to eat your soul or turn your children into festive circus decorations. And the 10th time, they're merely looking to enslave you. So yet again, the argument flounders because the supposed critique is ridiculous. Not only is the Imperium not racist in any way that we would perceive it, as it is a massive multicultural and multi-ethnic society, but it is not xenophobic either, as there are very compelling reasons to fear the Xenos. And so at long last we arrive at the most odious argument of all. The Imperium is a satire of fascism. I already did a full video on this years ago, so if you're looking for a longer answer than no, it's not, and please go sodomize yourself with a live lionfish, then I suggest looking that video up. But to summarize the most salient point, the Imperium is not fascist because it literally could not be fascist. Even if the Imperium desperately wanted to, the logistical challenges of maintaining direct control over 1 billion worlds separated by distances so enormous the communication lag is measured in years would make it impossible. There can be no central state control, and what little central authority the Imperium does have over its far-flung worlds is near universally religious. The Imperium is unified far more by the Ministorum than the Administratum, and even the ubiquitous ecclesiarchy can only enforce so much control, as most worlds deviate from their teachings in some way, some minor, some major. And so in essence, the Imperium could most easily and fittingly be described as a form of theocratic oligarchy, where the elites in the form of planetary governors and ruling nobility of various levels, from the humble provincial lord all the way to the masters of terror, maintained their own largely separate feudal domains, unified by a generalized shared belief structure and bonds of mutual loyalty and protection. The Imperium's role in all of this, as a larger entity, is primarily to facilitate that protection, to marshal the numberless armies of humanity against the latest invading threat, or in the reclamation of lost territory. This is why the imperial tithe is most often paid in manpower, and regiments raised rather than a tax on more traditional wealth. And if this is enough to make the Imperium fascist, then I sure hope you don't live in a nation that's a member of NATO, or I have bad news for you. So, with the usual arguments quite easily dismissed, honestly, the far more interesting question is, why does this argument, heavy quotation mark on the argument part, keep reappearing? Well, that has to do with the pretty serious divide in the worldview which we are currently experiencing. A month or so ago, I made a video called Warhammer 40k is inherently right-wing, and why the left can't understand that. In that video, I presented an interesting idea put forth by American psychologist Jonathan Haidt, that our worldview and in turn our political outlook is formed by a series of moral taste buds. You should check out that video for a more complete breakdown, but the point of it was to show that people that describe themselves as left and right have vastly different moral value structures. Where a right-winger will value all of the moral foundations to some degree, the exact opposite of extremism, a self-professed left-winger will outright reject certain moral values, to the point of viewing things like authority or purity to be inherently, fundamentally bad, for the simple reason that they are perceived to be in opposition to the moral values the left does care about, like, for example, care. With this in mind then, remember how we defined satire, and how the goal of satire was to critique? Well, in my, and I would dare venture most of our world views, 40k fails that standard of satire for the reasons already laid out. But what if, in the example of racism and xenophobia, what if you did not actually value the sanctity and survival of the human race? What if you in fact had such a strong outgroup preference that you would view it as desirable to embrace the Xenos races, even if it meant the destruction of the Imperium? It might sound absurd. What human would wish for the annihilation of humanity? But have you watched the news lately? We are living through a microcosmos of that right now. And if you do in fact believe that the other is worth more than your own, then, well, the satire does indeed land. Because the Imperium's justification that the aliens are enormously dangerous is irrelevant. In fact, that is precisely why the term xenophobic is used, because to a left-winger, it is irrational to wish to preserve one's own people and culture over that of others. And hell, that's an optimistic and charitable position, as most of the time as we've been seeing in our current history, it's difficult enough to get the left to even admit that we might have a culture at all. And of course, if anyone were to assert that we do have, that would be racist as well. That is how strong of an outgroup preference the left has developed. That, in fact, the culture of the other is inherently of greater worth. And so even an indirect defense of one's own is repugnant. See the response to All Lives Matters contra Black Lives Matter for further ample proof of that. And once we view things in this light, it starts to make a lot more sense why this conversation keeps returning. For whilst I would say that the Imperium is not a satire of authoritarianism, because if it is anything but authoritarian, it would be destroyed, thus it fails to critique the concept of authoritarianism, but instead indeed makes it an essential part of simple survival. But to a left-wing radical, to whom all authority is fundamentally bad, then, well, anything that relies upon it, regardless of how justified it may be, is bad, and thus satirical. Unless, of course, that authoritarianism stems from the correct ideology, of course. This is why the Tau get a pass. Because their collectivist ideology, based on an absolute mantra handed down from on high, tickles the progressive pickle just right, and reminds them of our current year. But perhaps I'm stretching here. Perhaps this is just something unique to 40k. Can we find other examples where this logic applies? Oh, yes we can. Introducing everyone's favorite, the combat wheelchair. Now, this thing should, by all reasonable and natural rights, be satire. Of the remarkable lengths people will go to in order to insert their own identity politics into any scenario, no matter how ludicrous. In this case, the fetishistic levels of affirmation only found on the farthest fringes of Mao Zedong's fandom, where, in a world of healing magic, of miracle potions or regeneration, there are those who choose to be disabled, not for any practical or logical reason, but as, and I paraphrase, an affirmation of their flaws as a positive, meaningful aspect of their identity. A literal celebration of weakness, and a resolute refusal to correct a flaw even when the cure is presented on a silver platter, when it would require no effort at all, no sacrifice, because, well, it's a game of Dungeons and gosh darn dragons. And yet still, real-life identity triumphs. And the affirmation does not stop there, because actually representing the difficulties, and thus the ridiculousness of a combat wheelchair in a Dungeons & Dragons setting, would somewhat undermine the hug box. And so, the original variant came with several special rules, like ignoring all movement penalties for grasslands, forests, coasts, and mountains. The wheelchair also floats up and downstairs, will always move at a speed of 25 feet unless going downhill, where it is doubled. The user can also never be forcibly dismounted from the chair, and the chair itself can only be destroyed after taking 3 consecutive critical hits. And since I'm fully on board with the death of the author, I quite confidently declare this indeed to be satirical. I mean, come on. But, of course, if we yet again return to the moral values we see that is popular on the left, then this could not possibly be satire in the eyes of a progressive, since what it is critiquing, coddling someone far beyond all imaginable limits, would fall under the care category. And the obvious objections, the idea that a wheelchair would suffer no movement penalties in a mountain, is simply ignored as, I don't know, authoritarianism, I guess? The tyranny of reality. After all, there is no force more universally oppressive than life, I guess. But then, in the end, if our assertion here is true, that one's moral point of view also determines one's view on satire, are we simply forced to conclude that satire is subjective, in the eyes of the beholder and all that? Well, to an extent, but I would also offer a rebuttal here, as the purpose of satire is to critique. It must therefore also be able to actually understand that which it is critiquing, at least on a basic level, for if it does not, then as with the example of Starship Troopers, the thing it is attempting to critique is simply not present in the supposed satire. And if the piece of satire simply fails to reflect reality, as with our porcelain pony, then we can confidently state that regardless of viewpoint, it is not satire. As if you were to try to make it satire, you would need to forcibly reinterpret or add to the material we have already, like the common argument that the Federation attacked the bugs first, or that it somehow staged Buenos Aires. This is why we can quite confidently decree that at the very least in part, satire is not solely subjective, as the left's refusal to see the right's moral values does not mean they are not there, duh, but quite simply that the left's interpretation is wrong. This is also why the intent of the author is only of some potential value. I am sure you have heard satire requires clarity of purpose, but that is again only half the formula, as one can have all the intent in the world to make a satire, all the clarity of purpose if you will, but if one still fails to actually put any of the things one is satirizing in the product, then, well, it is not satire. This is why the left-wing satire often falls flat, because it is simply blind to many of the right's moral considerations, and thus the moral considerations of a sizable portion of the population, and why we can at least in part decree it to not be solely subjective, though it does also then open the window for another, slightly wider discussion continuing the above quote. Satire requires a clarity of purpose and target, lest it be mistaken for and contribute to that which it intends to criticize. This is an argument often levied again against 40k, that its lack of obvious enough satire, or its refusal to be satire, is encouraging the far-right boogeyman. So let's address this for a second as well. Let's first go a little bit back. As mentioned, the whole satire requires a clarity of purpose point is only half the formula, but the mistaken for a contribution to that which it intends to criticize is a real possibility that bad satire, or in my opinion non-satire, actually lends gravity to the argument of that which it is satirizing. Quotation marks, either through justifying the action's intent of the target by, well, screwing up the framing, or worse still, completely failing to clearly show why it is bad. For this, let me show you a couple of examples from Germany, with the first being Ist wieder da, Look Who's Back. This is a satirical comedy that shows Hitler returning to the modern day. And nobody, of course, believes that it is actually Hitler, even though he himself never even for a moment pretends to be anybody but Hitler. Together with a television producer who thinks Hitler is just totally hilarious and believes him to be a comedy act, and thus a good way for him to make a hit show to get back into the good graces of his TV bosses, he and Hitler travel across Germany and talk to people about their problems. Problems from 2014 Germany that we recognize all too well today. Immigration and crime, cultural clashes with no resolution in sight, even bad entertainment, and the politicians' apparent inability and or outright unwillingness to do anything about it. Again, sounding eerily familiar, doesn't it? It's almost goddamn eerie to watch that movie today and see these problems even more clearly now. And how it has taken us 10 years to even truly begin to effectively understand, fight back against, and counter some of these problems. And the movie presents these concerns as somewhat silly, as nonsense, because they are talking to people in 2014 who can't properly put into words what is happening because none of us could. In 2014, all of us were still confused as to, wait, what's happening to our golden age? Why is things getting worse? What is all of this nonsense? What do you mean racism? Why we eradicated that like 14 years ago? I don't understand. Why is crime skyrocketing? Why are so many new people arriving in the country, and why aren't they behaving? All of these questions that back then seemed almost silly because none of us understood the root causes of them can be seen with a lot greater clarity today, which we will return to, but then comes Hitler. He is given a TV slot because the people at the TV station too agrees, oh yeah, no, this comedian is hilarious. And they put him on and expect him to make a clown of himself with all of these silly complaints. They have even a bunch of people write up racist jokes for him. Because that's all they view Hitler as some silly racist making dumb statements. Instead, Hitler goes on television and delivers a master class in oratory, starting his speech with complete silence, drawing everyone in, and only when he has everyone's absolute undivided attention does he give the silence a sound. And it is brilliant. It is short, it is pithy, it is witty, and it maintains brevity, whilst touching upon the problems of the nation and promising to do something the politicians could not to fix the problem. And in the movie, thus, he swiftly becomes incredibly popular. Too popular, as the movie needs to have him shoot a dog. You know, Adolf Hitler, famed animal lover. He always ends up shooting a dog for some reason. Oh, well, actually, we know for what reason. It is to make sure that the audience doesn't start thinking that this guy is making a little bit too much sense. It is a cheap yet effective way to remind you that you're not supposed to like this guy. And the movie has an honestly brilliant ending that makes the point that the authoritarianism is never quite so far away as we might think, and that all it takes is one man with drive and charisma to bring it all back. Now, unfortunately, this satire aged somewhat poorly. It still makes some excellent points, first and foremost, that in today's age, we don't even know what a fascist is, to the point where if Hitler himself rocked up and started to talk politics, a lot of people would find his talking points indistinguishable from the modern-day progressive. But the problems the German people were talking about then are the same problems as we are seeing now. In so many ways, 2014 seems like a lifetime ago, and yet it was a decade. And by the way, the problems we are referring to here is why literally yesterday, as I am recording this video, the German government collapsed because they refused to cooperate in any way with Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, one of the now largest parties in Germany and a staunch anti-immigration party. Germany's problems were as real in 2014 as they are in 2024. And the longer the politicians delay a solution we all know and understand, the greater the chance someone is going to take advantage. So in the case of Ist wieder da, it could be argued that today, the movie Satire does not land anywhere near as well as it once did, relying near entirely on the presumption that the audience will think Mustache Man bad, rather than effectively showing why Mustache Man bad. Now, the second movie, technically not a satire as it's not trying to be funny, does this in a far better way. It achieves its intended critique of authoritarianism very well indeed, and far slicker and impactful as well. This movie is Die Welle, The Wave, a movie I strongly urge everyone to see, as it demonstrates a full and complete understanding of the strengths and the persuasive arguments of the thing it criticizes. It presents a solid argument for authoritarianism. It gives these out piece by piece and builds up the movement, the wave. And then it simply lets it play out in a dramatized fashion, of course, to make the point clear and make sure everything arrives at a suitably impactful conclusion. But it is a fantastic example of how actually knowing the thing you criticize makes that critique actually impactful and effective. A lesson a lot of satire desperately requires. And now, we can finally wrap this up with 40k again, as the last allegation to address is, as mentioned, that 40k, by failing to be obvious satire, is a breeding ground for the far right. And as we have seen, poor satire can indeed end up making the very point it is trying to satirize, or at the very least muddy the waters. So what about 40k? Is it failing to be satire? Well, again, I firmly believe that 40k is simply not satire, so yes. But I suppose then the next question is, should it be satire? Should it be, in essence, played up so as to avoid it spawning more, largely imaginary, Nazis? No. Because again, whilst 40k is blatantly not satirical, it is also not an aspirational setting. Nobody looks at 40k and thinks, oh gosh, oh golly, what a lovely and well-functioning society. I sure would love to live here. Of course not. 40k is a hellscape of titanic proportions. It makes virtually every other setting out there look like a puppy's playpen. Just like 40k is not attempting to satirize the premier failed ideology of the 20th century, socialism, it is equally not trying to put forth an argument for an alternative style of government. As I said in my 40k's right-wing video, the Imperium holds to right-wing values simply because to do anything but would mean assured annihilation. Unless you're going to make the argument that our world is teetering on the brink of complete destruction, and believe me, I'm tempted to, then 40k really isn't offering much in the way of relevant current-day political commentary here. And most importantly of all, nobody thought it was. 40k's fanbase did not view their crazy over-the-top setting full with murder aliens, space marines and commissars as some sort of wink and a nod political theorem. It was to all of us a simple game, escapism. It was not until a suspiciously soy-smelling cadre of outsiders arrived and started speaking in newspeak that apparently Nazis began emerging from the woodworks. Now, sure, by all means correlation does not equal causation, but bearing in mind the human urge to balkanize, I find it supremely sus. The moment the international socialists showed up, then so too, allegedly, the nationalist ones. Especially as both flavors have a long and proud record of conjuring forth the spectre of the other to get their way. So, in a final, long overdue conclusion to a question that by Allah's ballsacks should be dismissed wherever possible. No, 40k is not satire, and it does not need to be satire. And the only reason why you would need it to be satire is if you are trying to make 40k have a political point that it has never had. And hopefully will never have. Having now finally tortured my way through this nonsensical question, I repeat yet again, my advice from the very beginning, just say no. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.